They said my land was ruining the neighborhood, so they buried my creek in concrete. 2 weeks later, their million-dollar lawns were underwater, their foundations cracking, and their HOA president was being led away in handcuffs. But let me tell you how we got there, because it started with a dead fish and a lie. That morning began like every other morning on Morrison land, with silence. The good kind. The kind that seeps into your bones, wraps around your lungs, and reminds you you're still breathing. My grandmother's old porch creaked beneath my boots as I stepped out, coffee in hand, camera swinging against my hip. I had planned to catch the spring migration, maybe photograph a warbler or two before the sun rose too high. But instead of birdsong and the familiar bubbling murmur of the creek, what I heard was nothing. No water, no wind, just a stillness so heavy it felt like the land itself was holding its breath. I took 2 steps forward and my gut twisted. From the porch, I should have been able to see Morrison Creek winding through the woods like it had for 100 years, cutting across my family's property like a silver scar of life. But the shimmer was gone, replaced by something flat, dull, and gray. I walked faster. Then I was running. When I reached the creek bed, or what used to be one, I stopped dead. Concrete. Thick, lifeless slabs of it poured straight through the channel, bothering every rock, every ripple, every drop of running water. The stream was gone, not diverted, not redirected, buried. The concrete had already begun to dry in some areas, but still steamed in others, as if the earth itself was rejecting it. Then I saw them. Fish, dozens of them, scattered like war casualties across the gray. Minnows, creek chubs, one juvenile catfish, their scales dull, their mouths open. Some had started to bloat. Flies hovered above their lifeless bodies. Claiming the scene, I dropped to my knees. My hand moved on instinct, raising my camera, clicking as I scanned the damaged wide shots, close-ups, every angle I could capture. My hands were steady, but my heart wasn't, because I knew exactly what this meant. I wasn't just a man looking at a tragedy. I was a witness at a crime scene. You see, before I became a wildlife photographer, I was an environmental engineer. Spent years reviewing land permits, drainage blueprints, ecological impact reports. I knew what regulations looked like, and I knew what it looked like when someone pissed on them. Whoever did this didn't just cut corners. They declared war on nature, and they did it on my land. Then came the sound that made bile rise in my throat, the low growl of an SUV engine. I looked up to see a white Escalade barreling down my private drive like it belonged there. The vehicle practically gleamed, windows tinted, the name Piton Realty plastered across the side like a brand logo from a reality TV show about suburban tyrants. It stopped 10 feet from where I stood, and out stepped a man I knew too well, Richard Piton, president of the Silverest Estates, HOA, real estate mogul, overpriced wine drinker, serial invader of peace. He was wearing a powder blue suit, the kind that screams wealth and insecurity all at once. His shoes sank slightly into the moist earth, but he didn't seem to notice or care. Morning. Jake, he called out, like this was just another neighborly check-in. Hope we didn't disturb your morning routine. I stood slowly, wiped my hand on my jeans, and stared him down. You filled my creek with concrete. He gave a lazy shrug. Let's not get dramatic. The board approved a drainage project. Your stream's been causing erosion issues for the new home. The stream, I said, pointing behind me, has been here for over 100 years. That erosion is called nature. He smiled, teeth too white, eyes too cold. We're trying to build a premium community, Jake, and your situation doesn't exactly scream cohesive aesthetic. There it was, the mask slipping. You've turned down every offer we made. That's your right. But you have to understand, Silverest needs continuity, flow, unity. Your 3 acres are in the way. I raised my camera, still on, still recording. This conversation is over. He stepped closer, his cologne hitting me like a chemical spill. It doesn't have to be. We can work something out. Sell now, before things get complicated. I didn't respond, just stared at him long enough to make the silence uncomfortable. Piton adjusted his cufflinks. You can't fight the HOA forever. Morrison. We always win. Then he turned, climbed back into his Escalade, and roared off, spitting gravel like a tantrum. Back at the cabin, I sat at my grandmother's oak desk, solid, scarred, and lined with the scent of lavender sachets she used to tuck into drawers. I flipped through the folder labeled Land Rights. She'd kept everything: deeds, surveys, letters from county officials. It was all there. And in the middle, folded carefully like a sacred relic, was a document from 1947. A clause, handwritten in cursive and stamped with the county seal: the natural waterway known as Morrison Creek shall remain unobstructed in perpetuity, with rights to its flow granted to all downstream properties and ecosystems dependent upon its waters. In perpetuity, I sat back and exhaled, the paper trembling in my hands. This wasn't just about ethics anymore. It was about law. They hadn't just poured cement, they had violated legal, historical, environmental water rights older than any home in Silverest Estates. I opened my laptop, logged into public records. My hands were still shaking, but now it was adrenaline. In less than 2 hours, I had the HOA board meeting minutes downloaded, highlighted, cross-referenced. Someone else had filed a FOIA request months ago, and the results were pure dynamite. In a closed-door session dated 3 months back, Piton had laid out what he called Operation Watershed. His words: Phase 1, restrict water flow. Phase 2, wait for seasonal flooding. Phase 3, buy the land cheap when it's distressed. They had voted 5-1. Only one dissenter, Barbara Henderson. I whispered her name like a prayer. They thought I was a stubborn hillbilly with a camera. They thought I'd sell. They thought I'd drown. What they didn't know was that my grandfather built railroads. My grandmother buried lawyers with paperwork. And I learned to shoot first with a rifle, then with a lens, and both. If aimed right, tell the truth, by sundown. I had the photos backed up in 3 locations, the documents scanned, a timeline built, and a plan forming. They wanted to bury Morrison Creek, but they'd just awakened something far older and far more dangerous than they'd ever expected. Me, with a camera, and nothing left to lose. Tyler Brooks didn't look like the kind of man who got dragged into conspiracies. He looked like someone who fixed things honestly, if clumsily, the kind of guy who shook your hand too hard and called everyone boss, whether they were or not. But that morning, sitting across from me in his rusted construction trailer on the south side of Durant County, Tyler looked like a man haunted by wet cement and late-night regrets. He stirred his coffee with a plastic knife, hands trembling just enough to rattle the styrofoam cup against the counter. When I pulled out the printed photos of the concrete dam in my creek high-res, time-stamped and irrefutable, he stared at them like they were crime scene photos, which, of course, they were. Jesus, he muttered after a long pause. I didn't think it'd look like that. Thought it was just some drainage slab, maybe a catch basin. He looked up at me, eyes red from sleepless nights or guilt, probably both. Dick told me it was all cleared, said the permits were in process. Said it'd help with runoff from those new bills. Did you file any permits yourself, I asked. I already knew the answer, but I needed to hear it from him. People don't just pour 20 yards of concrete through protected land without signing something. Tyler's shoulders slumped. He paid me in cash, 30% over my usual rate. Said it was off the books to avoid delays. I should have known. Hell, I did know, but I've got 3 kids and a custody battle that's bleeding me dry. He said it like an apology, like desperation was a valid building material. I didn't respond, just clicked my recorder off and slipped it back into my jacket pocket. That was enough for now. A recorded statement, a contractor with a conscience. And if I was right, the first crack in Piton's empire. Outside, the wind was kicking up dust across the lot, and Tyler walked me to the door like a man escorting his own regret. You gonna turn all this in, he asked, to the feds or whoever I already have. I said, but there's more coming. That wasn't a threat. It was a promise. over the next few days. I threw myself into the kind of work that made engineers lose sleep and gain ulcers. Data collection, aerial drone footage, water table measurements using tools I hadn't touched in years. I stood ankle deep in muddy lawns that had once been manicured perfection, photographing how the overflow from the dam was backing up into Silverest Estates like a rising curse. I made a map. I plotted every low-lying backyard, every inch of soggy foundation, every flooded flower bed where petunias now floated like funeral offerings. I used software that the county didn't even know existed yet, modeling water flow patterns and calculating the hydraulic head created by the artificial obstruction. The numbers didn't lie, and neither did the smell. Silverest Estates, the pride of Durant County, was rotting from the inside out. One morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing like it had something urgent to say. When I answered, the voice on the other end was calm, professional, and unmistakably government. Mr. Morrison, this is Sarah Mitchell with the County Environmental Protection Office. We've received anonymous reports of unpermitted construction affecting Morrison Creek. Are you available to meet on site? I am. I said, but you're going to want to wear boots. She arrived an hour later in a county-issued hybrid in a windbreaker that said Environmental Response Team in peeling white letters. She carried a clipboard like it was a weapon and shook my hand like someone used to dealing with people who lied for a living. What exactly are we looking at? She asked, staring down at the creek bed with a frown that deepened by the second. Criminal negligence. I replied, also known as HOA infrastructure upgrades. She nodded once, scribbled something, then pulled out a testing kit. For the next 30 minutes, we worked in silence, me photographing, her taking samples and measurements. She didn't say much, but the growing tightness in her jaw told me everything I needed to know. When she finished, she turned to me. I'm escalating this, she said. This isn't just a code violation. This may fall under federal jurisdiction. I almost smiled. About time. Over the next week, the swamp spread like a disease. Retention ponds overflowed. Basement windows filled with stagnant rainwater. The HOA hired a landscaping crew to aerate the lawns. But by then, the topsoil had already separated like frosting on a melting cake. People started whispering, and then they started yelling. From my porch, I watched a woman in yoga pants scream at a crew of bewildered gardeners. We paid 50 grand for this yard. It's a swamp. It's a goddamn swamp. I clicked the shutter. It wasn't just about water anymore. It was about perception. Silverest had promised luxury, prestige, lifestyle. Now it offered mold, mildew, and mud. And somewhere beneath that decay, the community was waking up from its curated dream. That's when the HOA called an emergency meeting. I wasn't invited. Of course, I wasn't a resident, according to their bylaws, but the county had a clause buried in its charter that allowed for public comments at HOA meetings when environmental concerns crossed jurisdiction lines. I packed my camera, my drone footage, and my engineering reports into a laptop bag and showed up 15 minutes early. The meeting was held at the Silvercrest Clubhouse, a gaudy Mediterranean-style building that looked like it had been airlifted in from a Florida retirement brochure. Faux columns, marble tile, the scent of lemon polish trying to cover up the damp. About 60 homeowners were already inside, buzzing with anxiety. And when Peyton saw me walk in, his face dropped like a curtain before a bad performance. He opened the meeting with a speech about temporary drainage anomalies and minor disruptions. It was laughable, until someone stood up and said, "My basement has 6 inches of water. My daughter's bedroom smells like a bun." And then I raised my hand. Point of order. I said, "May I address the board?" Peyton hesitated. Then Barbara Henderson, the lone dissenting vote from months ago, spoke up. "The public has a right to speak," she said. "The chair recognizes Mr. Morrison." Someone announced. I walked to the front, plugged my laptop into their projection system unsecured, of course, and pulled up a high-res satellite image of Morrison Creek before and after the dam. A collective gasp swept the room, slide after slide. I showed them the evidence. Flow disruption, water table rise, photographic proof of flooding, fish kills, and erosion. I cited code violations, statutes, water rights laws. Then I played a short audio clip. Tyler Brooks, his voice shaky but clear. Dick told me to pour it at night, said if anyone asked. We were fixing storm drains. Paid in time, no permits. The room exploded. Questions, accusations, threats of lawsuits. Barbara Henderson stood up again. Did we obtain any permits for this? She asked. Dick tried to smile. They're in process. No. Barbara said, they're not. I checked with the county. And then the doors opened. Sarah Mitchell walked in, holding a manila folder and a cease and desist order. Peyton, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. We need to talk. Now. The mighty president of Silverest Estates went pale. His hands trembled. His kingdom was falling apart. And the people were revolting. I stood in the back, camera at the ready, and captured the moment Dick had realized he wasn't in charge anymore. Justice wasn't swift. It wasn't loud. But it was coming, and it had boots, a badge, and a clipboard. Tyler Brooks showed up at the county building with his shirt half tucked and guilt clinging to him like smoke. He walked into the room where Sarah Mitchell and I were waiting, holding a wrinkled manila envelope under one arm and a cup of gas station coffee in the other. He looked like a man who had carried too many secrets too far and was finally ready to put them down, even if it crushed him in the process. I didn't sign up for this, he said before he even sat down. I poured driveways. I fix foundations. I'm not... Whatever the hell this turned into, he dropped the envelope onto the table between us. Everything I've got, emails, text, sketches. Dick scribbled on the back of building permits. He called it Operation Watershed. Said we were going to take Durant County's eyesore and turn it into prime real estate. Eyesore, I muttered. That's what he calls my land. Tyler flinched. He said once you were out, they'd have room for 12 new lots. He even had buyers lined up, $3 million apiece. Sarah flipped open the envelope and began scanning the documents, her pen already scribbling notes in the margin of a legal pad. Do you have proof he paid you in cash? Tyler nodded. I've got ATM receipts for deposits. I took out less than I got paid, so it wouldn't raise flags. And I wrote the rest off as side work in my books. Thought I was being smart. He paused, eyes hollow. Turns out, I was being used. He looked at me then, not defensive, just tired. I knew it was shady, but I didn't know he was poisoning the land. Poisoning, I asked. Straightening, Sarah pulled out a folded sheet from the envelope, reading aloud. Quick-set industrial mix, sourced from a demolition contractor in Louisiana. The mixture contains alkali silica residue, solvents, and trace heavy metals. This wasn't standard concrete. It was disposal waste, Tyler said, his voice dropping. Dick said he got it cheap because the guy needed to unload it fast. I figured it was just expired or off-brand. I didn't know it was toxic. I sat back in my chair, feeling the weight of it settle into my chest. This wasn't just about flooding anymore. This was environmental sabotage on a scale I hadn't imagined. Do you understand? Sarah said quietly, that what you're describing could qualify as hazardous dumping under both state and federal law. I do now, Tyler whispered. Sarah nodded. And you'll testify to all of this if it helps fix what we broke. Yeah, I'm not looking to get off scot-free. I want my kids to be able to drink from a tap without me wondering what I helped put in the ground. After Tyler left, we sat in silence. Sarah finally spoke first. I've seen developers cut corners, seen inspectors look the other way, but I've never seen someone dump chemical waste into a living stream and call it landscaping. Her voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. She didn't just care, she was angry. And when someone like Sarah gets angry, things move. Within 48 hours, she had mobilized a full-scale investigation. County officials arrived with clipboards, boots, and a portable lab. They erected orange mesh fencing around the dam site, installed monitoring wells, and began testing the groundwater. News vans started circling the Silverest entrance like vultures sensing a meal. And the homeowners, once smug, once distant, now knocked on my door with damp insurance papers and anxious faces. One woman, Margaret Phillips, stood on my porch with an air of someone who had never knocked on a stranger's door in her life. "My husband's wine cellar has mold," she said, voice tight. "He's a retired attorney. We're hiring counsel. I understand you have documentation." I handed her a folder. "It's all in there. Timeline, photos, recorded statements." She took it like a loaded weapon. "Thank you," she said, and left without another word. The lawsuit started the next week. 5 homeowners filed, then 10. By the end of the month, nearly every resident of Silverest had joined a class action suit against the HOA and Piton Realty. The legal tsunami hit like a second flood, one that no landscaping crew could fix. In response, Piton went to war. He sent out a flurry of emails accusing me of manipulating the water table, of stirring panic, of being an eco-terrorist with a camera. One message, forwarded to me by Barbara Henderson, called me a rogue engineer orchestrating environmental sabotage to tank property values and defame this great community. I framed that one and hung it next to my grandmother's deed. But then things got strange. I started noticing unfamiliar cars parked near my property. Drones hovered longer than weather patterns. One night, I heard footsteps around the cabin and found my motion sensor lights disabled in the morning. Another night, I came home to find my mailbox smashed, its contents soaked and scattered across the gravel. I installed new locks, then cameras, then a backup generator. I wasn't paranoid. I was a target. Sarah arranged for a county deputy to start doing drive-bys. Piton's unraveling. She told me, cornered men make dangerous moves, but the more desperate he gets, the more reckless he becomes. That's good for us. She wasn't wrong. That week, a forensic accountant working with the county discovered that HOA funds earmarked for community beautification had been diverted, nearly $750,000 paid out in cash withdrawals, shady subcontractor payments, and fake invoices from companies that didn't exist. One of those companies was Concrete Solutions, LLC, registered address, a P.O. box tied to Dick Piton's brother-in-law. The fraud charges were stacking up faster than sandbags in a storm. Meanwhile, Silverest Estates was sinking, literally. A private engineering firm hired by the homeowners issued a report declaring 6 properties at immediate risk for structural failure due to soil displacement and water intrusion. Insurance companies began denying claims, citing illegal construction. Open house signs disappeared. For sale listings vanished overnight. Silverest was now a name whispered with embarrassment instead of pride. At the center of it all stood Dick, refusing to blink. But cracks were forming. His allies on the board began to ghost him. Barbara Henderson quietly reached out to me again. "We're calling a special board meeting," she said over to the phone. "Emergency vote to remove him as president. We have the numbers, but he's threatening to sue anyone who opposes him." I didn't hesitate. "I'll be there," with receipts. The day of the meeting, I showed up early, laptop in one hand, a folder of printed evidence in the other. The Silvercrest clubhouse parking lot was full. The air buzzed with tension and damp summer heat. Inside, a mold specialist had set up an air quality monitor in the middle of the room like it was a medical exhibit. Dick sat at the front of the room, flanked by the few board members who still showed up. He looked like a dictator at the end of a very bad run, sweating through his collar. Eyes darting, voice raised just a little too high. "This emergency session is invalid," he announced, "improperly noticed. In violation of HOA regulations." Barbara stood. "Section 12(4), she said, voice clear. "Any board member may call an emergency meeting if property values are under material threat. I'd say a neighborhood swamp qualifies." Homeowners erupted in applause. Dick's face flushed purple. "This is a witch hunt." "No," I said, stepping forward, "it's an exorcism." And then, calmly, methodically, I laid out the case, slide by slide, payment logs, permit violations, satellite images, Tyler's signed affidavit, Sarah's chemical analysis, homeowner testimony, structural damage reports. The final slide, a bank of records showing HOA funds $1,000 withdrawn 3 days before the dam was poured. Memo line office supplies. Someone laughed. Then another. It spread like fire. Barbara called the vote. 5-0. Dick tried to shout, tried to threaten. Then Sarah Mitchell entered, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. "Mr. Peaton," she said, holding up a warrant. "You're under investigation for environmental crimes and financial fraud. We'd like to ask you some questions." He looked around for support. There was none. As they led him away, he turned to me. "This is all your fault." "Morrison." I raised my camera, focused, and took one final photo. "No, Dick." I said, "This is all yours." And just like that, the tyrant of Silverest was dethroned not by votes, not by outrage, but by water, truth, and the stubborn power of someone who refuses to be moved. 3 months later, I stood on the courthouse steps with Rebecca Chen at my side, watching the morning dew burn off the stone like fog surrendering to truth. She adjusted the strap on her briefcase and gave me a look that could steady a landslide. "Let him talk," she said. "Guys like this always do. Just let him dig." Inside, the gallery was packed. Homeowners from Silverest filled the benches in tense clusters, some in suits, others in work boots, but all of them tight-jawed, bracing for the last gasp of a man who had turned their dream homes into liabilities. Reporters sat shoulder to shoulder with environmental advocates and a handful of local officials pretending not to be interested. The air buzzed with fluorescent light and anticipation. Even the judge's gavel seemed to echo deeper than usual. Judge Clarissa Harrison presided, late 60s, steel-gray bob, and a face carved from a lifetime of sifting lies from law. She glanced at the docket, then looked up at the plaintiff's table where Dick Peaton sat alone. "I see you're representing yourself." "Mr. Peaton," she said, voice dry as autumn leaves. Dick stood, thinner than he'd been, but still clinging to the illusion of control in his wrinkled navy suit. "Yes, Your Honor. I've been unable to secure adequate representation due to the defendant's aggressive disinformation campaign." He motioned toward me without looking. "Duly noted." Judge Harrison said, "Proceed with your motion for summary judgment." And just like that, the man who once ruled Silverest like a private kingdom launched into a monologue so surreal it could have been pulled from a pulp courtroom drama. He accused me of sabotage, of engineering a false environmental crisis to tank property values and harm his reputation. He claimed I had manipulated the water table using outdated construction plans, leveraging my background as an engineer to destabilize the entire development. He even implied that I had faked the fish kill using frozen specimens from a local bait shop. Rebecca didn't blink. "Your Honor," she said when it was our turn, "we have time-stamped photographs, water flow data, county testing reports, and an on-record confession from the contractor Mr. Peaton hired to illegally install the dam. The only thing my client engineered recently is the exposure of Mr. Peaton's crimes." She approached the bench with a neatly organized binder, which Judge Harrison flipped through slowly, one by one. We laid out the evidence: aerial drone footage showing pre- and post-concrete flow, environmental reports from Sarah Mitchell's team, detailing the chemical contamination in the water, financial records showing HOA funds diverted to shell companies, Concrete Solutions, LLC, Watershed Management Group, and my personal favorite, Premium Living Dynamics, which turned out to be a defunct gym Dick's cousin had owned for 8 months. We submitted a video deposition from Tyler Brooks, who, looking wrecked in a rumpled shirt and worn baseball cap, described in vivid detail how he was paid in cash to pour illegal concrete under cover of night, but the death blow came in the form of a confession from a former county official who had been quietly cooperating with Sarah's investigation. In the video, he looked straight at the camera, pale and sweating. "Peaton paid me 25 grand to approve the initial development. He said it was just paperwork, that the wetlands didn't really qualify anymore because of climate drift. He handed me a thumb drive and a bottle of bourbon, said the Army Corps wouldn't check twice. By the time the video ended, Dick's face was ghost white. 'I object,' he shouted, springing to his feet. 'This is entrapment, a conspiracy.' These people are coordinated environmental extremists trying to destroy my legacy. Judge Harrison didn't even raise her voice. Mr. Peaton, sit down or I'll hold you in contempt. He did, muttering under his breath, but his eyes scanned the room like a man hoping for backup that would never come. Even the three people who had sat behind him at the start of the hearing had quietly migrated to the other side of the aisle. Then came the counterclaim. Rebecca stood tall. Your Honor, my client is seeking damages for trespass, destruction of private property, environmental degradation, emotional distress, and defamation. We also request that any remaining assets in Mr. Peaton's control be frozen until the criminal investigation concludes. The judge turned the pages slowly, carefully, lips pursed in thought. I've seen enough, she said finally, placing her glasses on the bench. Mr. Peaton, your lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, based on the material presented today, I'm referring your actions to the District Attorney for Criminal Prosecution under state and federal environmental laws. Financial fraud and abuse of fiduciary duty. Her gavel struck the block like thunder. Dick exploded. This is a witch hunt, he screamed. These people are jealous. They hated that I built something beautiful. He turned to me, pointing as officers approached. You destroyed Silverest. You and that goddamn creek. I stood. No. Dick, you did. I just took the pictures. The bailiffs took his arms and led him stumbling from the courtroom. As they reached the doors, he turned one last time and shouted, This isn't over. I know people. But the doors closed behind him, and his voice didn't echo. Outside, the crowd of residents and reporters swarmed like bees. Rebecca and I made our way down the steps slowly. I answered questions with short, careful statements. I wasn't interested in gloating. The point wasn't victory, it was restoration. Sarah met us at the bottom of the stairs, holding a clipboard and a phone still buzzing from incoming calls. The Army Corps has been notified. She said, they're sending a team next week. We're starting with dam removal and soil reclamation. It's going to take months, maybe longer, but we'll get that creek back. I looked out over the line of TV trucks and anxious homeowners. And the funds. She nodded. Federal seizure is underway. Turns out Dick was hiding money in no less than 6 offshore accounts. We've recovered about $3 million so far. That'll cover cleanup and start reimbursing victims. I took a breath that felt a little easier than the one before it. That night, I stood on the porch and watched the moonlight glint off the concrete in the creek bed one last time. The silence was different now, no longer heavy with helplessness, but filled with a strange, settling stillness. The kind that comes before something begins again. In the days that followed, the work began. Hazmat teams arrived to break apart the dam piece by piece. Hauling out toxic concrete in special containers, workers in Tyvek suits moved carefully, lifting with precision to avoid sending further pollutants into the soil. Sarah directed crews with the intensity of a field general and the patience of a gardener. The first sign of life came quietly. A trickle of water, no more than a stream from a leaky faucet, curled down the trench. It skipped over rocks like a timid child returning home after a storm. I watched from a distance as it pooled briefly, then surged forward. As if relieved to move again, nature always returns. Given the chance, Silverest changed too. The lawsuits had stripped it of its glamour. Houses once worth $2 million were being appraised at half. Many residents left, tired of the legal battles, the stigma. But those who stayed, something shifted. They started having block parties, potlucks instead of policy votes. Barbara Henderson was elected HOA president in a landslide. And her first act was rewriting the bylaws no board member could spend over $5,000 without a community-wide vote. Major changes required a 75% majority. Transparency replaced tyranny. One afternoon, Barbara stopped by my cabin with a tray of lemon squares and an apology. We saw you as a problem, she said, her voice heavy, but you were the solution all along. I poured us coffee. We sat in silence for a while, watching a red-tailed hawk circle above the trees. Morrison Creek gurgled softly behind us. The land was healing. In a few months, I hosted a photo exhibit in town titled, When HOAs attack a natural history of unnatural disasters, the centerpiece was a triptych, the creek as it was, the dam as it fell, and the stream reborn. People stood in front of those photos for long minutes, eyes wide, mouths thin. Sarah gave a speech at the opening. This case, she said, has rewritten how we handle environmental enforcement across the county. It's proof that one camera, one stubborn resident, and one creek can change everything. But the real ending came quietly, like most truths do. A call from the County Historical Society. Barbara had been helping them digitize old records and stumbled on something. Jake, she said, your great-great-grandfather wasn't just a landowner. He was a water rights surveyor. He helped draft the original designation for Morrison Creek as a protected channel. It's been illegal to obstruct it since 1892. I laughed out loud, even from the grave. The Morrisons were fighting. That evening, I stood at the edge of the newly restored stream. The sun melted behind the ridge, painting the water gold. A great blue heron touched down, graceful and unbothered, as if it had always been here. I raised my camera, framed the shot, and clicked. The sound of the shutter echoed like closure, not just for me, for the land, for the creek, and maybe, if we're lucky, for everyone who's ever been told they were standing in the way of progress, when in truth, they were the only ones holding the line. 6 months after Judge Harrison's gavel fell and the dam was torn apart, piece by toxic piece, I stood on my back porch and watched Morrison Creek wind its way through the land like it had never been interrupted. It gurgled softly between moss-covered stones, its waters clear again, catching sunlight in flashes that made it look like it was made of glass and memory. The air smelled like pine and promise. Somewhere downstream, a pair of otters splashed in a shallow bend, reclaiming territory as if they'd only been gone for a season instead of nearly losing their home forever. Behind me, the restoration crews were packing up. The Army Corps had exceeded every expectation, not just removing the damage, but re-engineering the watershed to flow more naturally than it had in decades. They added boulders to slow erosion, replanted native grasses and wetland reeds, and built a new overflow channel to ensure that even the worst storm couldn't flood Silverest again. That final piece, the irony that saving my creek is the only thing that could ever really protect their homes, never failed to make me smile. The houses, however, told a different story. Silverest Estates, once a showroom of suburban aspiration, now looked more like the site of a high-end cautionary tale. Real estate agents tried to call it a market correction, but the numbers didn't lie. $2 million homes were being listed for $900,000 and still weren't moving. Several stood empty, their owners long gone, grass overtaking driveways like nature was swallowing back what it had reluctantly ceded. The community was quieter now, but more connected. The HOA, rebuilt from the ground up under Barbara Henderson's leadership, had shifted its mission from enforcement to empathy. Gone were the days of grass height citations and mailbox color wars. In their place were neighborhood barbecues, shared gardening projects, and a monthly town hall where people actually listened. People knew each other's names, helped carry groceries, looked each other in the eye again. One of the biggest surprises was Tyler Brooks. He could have vanished after the trial, taken his tarnished reputation and faded into another town, but he didn't. Instead, he signed on as a consultant for the restoration team, said if he was going to be part of breaking something, he wanted to be part of fixing it too. He walked the entire neighborhood with engineers, pointing out buried lines and secret shortcuts Dick had insisted on during construction. Turns out, he knew Silverest's infrastructure better than anyone alive. I know every pipe and trench in this place, he told Sarah Mitchell during one site inspection. I might as well help unclog its soul while I'm at it. He even brought his kids one weekend to help replant trees. I caught a photo of his youngest, probably 6 years old, kneeling in the mud, gently placing a sapling into the earth like she was tucking in a baby. That photo ended up on the front page of the county paper under the headline, "A New Season for Silverest." And Dick beat him. He was currently 3 months into a 5-year federal sentence for environmental crimes, wire fraud, and embezzlement. His defense team tried everything, arguing persecution, entrapment, even claiming cognitive decline. But the jury took 2 hours to reach a unanimous verdict. During sentencing, the judge looked him dead in the eye and said, "You didn't just destroy land. Mr. Peyton, you destroyed trust. You manipulated a community into worshiping your vision while you hollowed it out from the inside. You mistook fear for leadership. The federal government froze his assets, including the shell companies and offshore accounts we had uncovered. Forensic accountants were still chasing down the last of it, but they had already recovered nearly $3 million, much of which was being used to reimburse homeowners and fund ongoing environmental monitoring. It was satisfying in a way that didn't feel like revenge, just balance. One morning, Margaret Phillips walked up the gravel path carrying a basket of still warm blueberry muffins. She looked different from the woman who had once called my home a visual liability in an HOA meeting. Less polished, maybe, but more real. "I owe you an apology," she said, looking slightly embarrassed. We all do. We were so focused on our property values that we forgot about what really gives property value. Integrity, resilience, the kind of things you can't list on a brochure. I smiled and took a muffin. "Water under the bridge," I said, and then laughed. Or, "Over the dam?" I guess. She laughed too. You know, we're thinking of selling. Not because of the damage, most of that's fixed now, but because this whole thing made us realize we don't need a $4 million house to be happy. We're looking at a farmhouse, no HOA, room for a garden. She left the basket and walked back through the trees, leaving the scent of warm blueberries and something like closure behind. With the restoration complete, I finally curated my full photographic collection into an exhibit. When HOAs attack a natural history of unnatural disasters, the gallery opening drew a surprising crowd: journalists, environmentalists, former board members, and residents from all over the county who had their own stories of overreaching power. The photos were displayed in narrative order: the creek before, the day of the disaster, the escalation, the courtroom battle, and finally the rebirth. At the center was a single photo: Dick Peyton, mid-shout, being led away in handcuffs while Silverest residents stared after him with expressions that ranged from sorrow to something dangerously close to satisfaction. That shot, timed perfectly, captured not just the end of a reign, but the beginning of reckoning. Sarah Mitchell gave a speech during the opening night. "This case," she said, "has reshaped how our county enforces environmental law. We've implemented mandatory permit audits for all HOA projects. We've set up a resident reporting hotline. Most importantly, we've made it harder for any one person to wield unchecked power under the guise of community improvement." The applause was long, loud, and entirely deserved. 2 weeks after the exhibit closed, Barbara called with a final twist. "You sitting down?" she asked, voice humming with excitement. "Should I be the County Historical Society found something? Your great-great-grandfather wasn't just a landowner. He worked for the Central Railroad as a water rights surveyor. He helped write the legislation that designated Morrison Creek as a protected waterway. In 1892, I nearly dropped my coffee. So the clause in my grandmother's deed wasn't just a family relic. It was legal armor forged by your ancestor. You've been defending his work all along." I walked outside and looked down at the creek, the sun painting it in molten gold. For a moment, I could almost see him, my great-great-grandfather, standing at the edge of that same bank with a transit and tripod, drawing lines not just on a map, but in history. He knew what this place meant. He knew it needed protecting. Even now, the water flowed where it always had, over rocks shaped by time and roots that held firm. No cement, no obstruction. Just current, memory, and the quiet defiance of a stream that refused to be silenced. I raised my camera one more time and took a photo, because some victories don't scream, they whisper and flow.